Thank you.
I think Mr. Ajit Singh has been selected for the Lifetime Achievement Award, and for which I think a separate citation would be done, and for which again it's a memento at this stage is not given. Right, so now I address Mr. Kurakiwala, again the respected, the most distinguished personality of the Indian pharmaceutical industry. I think if I can introduce him as the Dian of, say, Indian pharma industry, I think it would be the right thing to do so. I would specifically request him to come and give us the keynote address for this Medico marketing meet. Before which, I'll just have a formal introduction of him. Mr. Kurakiwala, I think as we know, is a very soft-spoken, friendly and easy, accessible for those who are seeking his professional help. He is acclaimed as a very successful strategist with a unique vision and a strong determination to head his company as a multidisciplinary, R&D-oriented and highly respected Indian pharmaceutical major, touching newer heights in terms of annual turnovers. In a span of less than 3 decades, Wockhardt has grown from a mere partnership firm to a major giant. Today the company ranks among the top 5 pharmaceutical companies in India, and the full credit goes to him. According to a leading Indian business publication, the company has been adjudged as the best of board directors this company has in the pharma industry. Mr. Kurakiwala is much admired and respected by his employees as well as the peers in the industry for what he has contributed to the growth and success of Wockhardt over the years. So he is the chairman for this particular group, and we wish him all the best in the coming years. And now I request him to come and address the keynote address to us.
Ray, my colleagues in the industry, Mr. Brahma, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. Ajit Singh and Mr. Tapan has already set the pace in terms of giving you a perspective of the industry and the opportunities all of us have in India and elsewhere. I believe, the role of a keynote speaker should be primarily to create a context, set a pace, maybe give an overview of a picture, not necessarily on marketing alone, but on the issues happening all around us, and probably challenge all of us in terms of thinking afresh. Because I think what happens that all of us work with a certain way, and unless we look at in a broader perspective what is happening around, probably we may have to look at issues, how we need to respond to that. So I hope if I can achieve a little bit of those, and probably the speaker which will follow will pick up specifically from that in context of the marketing, I think we would have served that purpose. What I would like to do today to cover broadly 3 areas. I'll really, because each one of them actually would is a talk by itself, but I'll try to do a very brief on each one of them. One is creating a very quick global scenario which would be emerging in next several years, a prescription for Indian industry, and a peep into 2020. Now, as you could see, each one of them would deserve a 45-minute talk, but I think I'll try to do a very brief, you may say an executive overview of this situation. Yeah, the next one. I think one of the aspects of very major change taking place, as you would see, is the, you can just move, is the way the technologies have been changing. And there has been a very dramatic change in technology on one hand, and these barriers to technology is changing. Now just to give you an idea, in 1980, as you could see, the global GDP was about $10 trillion, and only 16% was the global contestable area. Means your technologies, your marketing, all the barriers were there about 20 years back, and only 16% you could say, okay, you could do the same thing in other part of the world. Today you are looking at $25 trillion, and about 80% of world you can do the same thing. I think in other words what we are seeing a major shift. When we talk of globalization, I think the real impact of globalization is this, that these barriers are breaking down. Tapan Ray mentioned about WTO, and that is another barrier is breaking down in India. So there is no difference what we do here in India or what would happen anywhere else in the world. Let's look at another element I tried to bring. This is a multinational view, but I think that is something which is happening. That the products which were introduced by the international companies in the early 90s, for example, Zolofet and Diflucon, took 5 years to market in 90 or 80 countries, as you could see. And you could see the recent introduction, Viagra and Lipitor, were introduced in 1 or 2 years in 90 to 100 countries. So what is happening is companies are introducing newer drugs very rapidly, because that is where this world has shifted. It was a restricted world earlier. The world is becoming broader and broader, and they want to have these opportunities available much faster. And let us see what is happening. The drugs which were introduced 10 years back are not even $1 billion product. Drug introduced 1 or 2 years back like Lipitor, these are $4 and $5 billion products. So I think we are in a world which is global in terms of business and moving at an enormous pace of the changes which is taking place. And I think when you look at an R&D area or a biotech area, I think all aspects, whether it is genomics or it is informatics or molecular modeling or computational chemistry, I think these are the elements of biotech. And who is leading this? Is it the large global multinational companies, or are these a smaller or a medium-sized company? And I think when you look around the names of the companies, these are these smaller companies who are leading this revolution. And these are the companies which are going to make an impact of the technological change which will be taking place more than any large companies alone. It is one thing that these companies will be ultimately acquired by the big ones, but the change will be brought about primarily by the small and the middle-sized companies. And you see the revolution which is taking place. You look up any international magazines, journals, these are the cover page story today. The very interesting thing not many of us know, that in 1990, for example, there were about 3 new molecular entities which were a biotech. And this went on increasing year after year, and in 1998, not 3, there were 3% were biotech, 27% already new entities are a biotech origin. So I think we are living in a world of biotechnology and genomics in years to come. And I think these are the newer areas. Country like us have an opportunity to start from a zero base. The other conceptual framework which I just want to share is the mid-sized companies in a global context. I think in a global context, the biggest in India is a small company. But small to mid-sized companies can create a kind of a global alliance with many mid-sized companies available in the rest of the world. Like for example in Europe, companies with a turnover of about $500 million to $2 billion very few have those kind of numbers here, are about 50 to 75 companies there in Europe. Now similarly, many companies in other parts of the world are emerging, Korea, Japan, US, and in India also in future. And I think there is an interesting conceptual for, like you have been familiar with the Airlines Alliance. Similarly, mid-sized companies can form an alliance to compete with the big pharma companies because they are strong in their own areas of maybe a distribution and marketing. And I think these are where the technologies and research can be leveraged through these kind of alliance. And these are the things which will going to take place in years to come. So what are the implied strategic options for the Indian companies? So if we just stay with this, okay, what is happening today is the global generic and global bulk drugs. I think Mr. Ajit Singh talked about in depth about it. India has a good position. This market is expanding. And I think what is important, we must recognize that in US, in Europe, even though in terms of the dollar value, the generics would be about 12 or 15% of the total pharma business. But in terms of prescription, in US, for example, it is 45% of the prescription are generics. In fact, in terms of prescription, Mylan, which is a generic company, is #1 in terms of prescription in the United States, and not Pfizer's or Merck. In UK, for example, 63% of prescription are the generics. So in terms of dollar value, generics will always be small, but in terms of absolute usage of medicine, it is enormous. It is more than 50%, even in the developed countries. I think many of us do not know, and I think this would mean that generics is going to remain there and stay there. But it will change. Today you are looking at chemistry-based generics. 10 years we'll be talking about biotech-based generics. The second part of the strategic option, as I just mentioned, is this kind of web of alliances of the mid-sized companies. Now if you look at the and see research, I think some of the companies have already initiated research and they've got a lot of breakthroughs, and then this is something which will continue to go move forward. The other element would be consolidation. I think in Indian context there has to take place much more consolidation than what we have today. And I have classified some of these as an old game. That is what is happening today. And these are the newer things which would be happening in the next 10 years or so, 5 to 10 years. Because the consolidation is a must, because that would be the economic realities of doing business in this country. And the size would be important because the resources required for research, resources required for global marketing or global alliances would necessitate, if we have to create the value in the organization, there will be some natural consolidation will take place. It will take much longer than what we anticipate in a normal circumstances, because most of us are family owned, we have started our own companies, there are very strong emotional bonds to our own organization, and that would be very difficult to break, and that would slow the process, but that is inevitable to happen. No, sorry, just go back. The last aspect is this marketing, penetration of domestic market, because I think Mr. Tapan did mention that what we are reaching is only a very small part of a domestic market, 28–30%. And with growth in GDP, which is now running at around 6 to 7%, and our Prime Minister tells every time when I hear him in last 6 months or so, he is now talking of 9% and 10% GDP growth. I wish this becomes a reality, and I think that happens, then there is enormous semi-urban and rural market getting generated over the next 10 years. And I think this is the strategic option all of us have. We have to decide what is our options. Next. Very briefly, I would like to touch upon some of the prescription the industry has to do. I think we have been talking, government should solve our problems, but I think that is one aspect of the situation. And we have a government fora, that is something we can always take up with the government fora. But I think when we are amongst us, let's see what we have to do in order to meet some of these challenges. I think first, as I mentioned, there would be a change in industry structure. And then I think all of us should be open for this option of creating real value, because I think many of us have seen that the bulk drug industry 5 years back was thriving. All of us wanted to go into bulk drug industry, or many have invested money in the bulk drug industries. And a few years back, some of us were interested to take a position in this, but nobody wanted to sell. And what has happened today? There are no buyers. What has happened to bulk drug industry 5 years back could happen very well to other parts of our industry 5 years from today. So I think it is one who sees this kind of future which is emerging. And wherever there is a value in the market, to encash it at the right time. I think that is something which would be something which would take place, and I think that is something which we should look at very seriously. The next one. Attracting talent. I think one of the major challenges all of us have is to attract talent, not only within the countries, because within the country, as far as when we talk of research and technology, there is a limitation of talent. There is a talent available in the public sector, you can get those talent. But I think we must recognize that there is enormous talent available outside India, of people of our own origin, Indian origin. There are two options available. You can have a reverse brain drain, two ways. One is to invite them into our own country and work in our research facilities. They need a certain degree of an environment in terms of technology, in terms of the infrastructure you have for research. I think us and few other companies have been able to attract those talents back home. The other way you can get this talent, Indian talent, and some of the companies are already doing, is to establish research, small capabilities where at the higher upper end, in US or in Europe, in conjunction with the research you do here. So I think both ways, talent is going to become a very important part of our strategy input. Many of us feel that if we have to go into research, and we can acquire locally, but what we are doing as an industry as a whole is playing a musical chair. And we are not increasing the talent pool. And I think that challenge we have is to increase this talent pool which is available. The third element I want to highlight is IT. And this information technology revolution which we have seen in genomics. Genomic revolution is really led by IT. If you know the history of the whole project, genome project, which was conceived in 1985, and that is a time when this project said that we will be able to decode the entire human genome by 2008. That was their objective. Early mid-90s, they revised this to 2003. In 98, they revised it forward. You know, these targets are moving forward, not backwards, to 2002. And finally, they completed the whole project in June 2000. This has happened mainly because of the speed with which IT industries have moved. And that may help the whole project in terms of decodifying the human genome. And I think this is something we must leverage in Indian context, in terms of our vendors, in terms of our supplier chain, in terms of the customer information. I think this is one area one needs to think a major change taking place in an Indian context. And I think this is where much more collective participation is important. In fact, we have this Indian Pharmaceutical Alliance, 9 of us are the members, and we have already decided to form a B2B portal. As far as the supply chain is concerned, the distributors and the chemists onwards, and I think obviously other companies can always join the portal when it gets commissioned. Next one. The third element is the seek alliances. I think this is in all areas, whether it is technology, whether it is people, whether it is the management process, whether these are the products, both ways, getting into licensing into the countries, seeking somebody's strength in sales and marketing elsewhere. So I think all kinds of alliances is something which is important, because I think no individual company, even the large companies, recognize that the alliances is the order of the day. And without alliances, it's not possible for a single organization to optimally leverage its own strengths. I think therefore we must recognize, instead of working in cocoons of our own organization, we must seek partnership with our competitors within the industry and within the country and outside the country. The lastly is obviously the build capabilities in key part of the business system. And this is where one is talking of really skill building. Yeah. Let me very quickly take you into a peep in 2020. What are going to be the key drivers? Now, this is some projection which is available from various published data of how the pharma industry, which is currently about 337 billion, is going to move in next 20 years. And what is projected in next 20 years, that it would move to be about $1 trillion industry in next 20 years. And what are the key drivers of this kind of a growth would be, generally in a global context, not in Indian context, is, as I mentioned, the simultaneous launch of the newer products. The whole genomic and biotech-led revolution also stimulates this kind of a growth, because every time you introduce a drug for a new therapeutic area, I think the value creation is much more for the industry. And therefore they are relatively higher priced, because what you substitute is absence of a solution. And also what you would see, the productivity and this reach. I just give you an example, that Pfizer's in USA, for example, have about 6,500 medical rep, and after their acquisition with Warner, their field force in US alone is 8,500. The level of penetration they have for the product is enormous. And I think this is what is going to happen when you have a larger and larger companies. And one of the stated objectives of Pfizer's after the acquisition is not to reduce the field force. The next one. Now, this kind of an explosive growth which is taking place, what are really the factors? In a domestic explosion, I think we touched upon some of the international. One is the GDP growth, which I did mention. If we are going to see 7–8% GDP growth in next 10 years, I think what we are seeing is a larger and larger markets. WTO ultimately is going to lead to higher prices of a new chemical entities which will be introduced. The usage is not going to come down because it is going to expand, and whatever 1%, 2%, 5%, 7%, as time goes, substitution will take place from generic to the prescription product, will show in dollar term, rupee term, a faster growth. And just to get you an example, what I'm projecting is the current consumption in dollar terms is $4. In 2010 it will go up to $9. It's not very unrealistic when you look at Philippines today is at $15, Brazil at $38, and Mexico at $50. To say that in India our consumption will move up from $4 to $9 in 10 years. And what are our opportunities outside India, as we have seen, and I think Mr. Ajit Singh also talked about it, is we could become a key source of supply of bulk and generics. The research area, I think there is a great opportunity to become a source for an outsource if proper government policy is there in terms of clinical research, the other elements of the whole value chain in the research where India can play a role, and our own capabilities as far as the biotech and new chemical entities are concerned. So what happens? Our turnover currently, as you know, is about $4 billion in dollar terms. And what would happen in normal course? It would go to about 10 billion or so with a current rate of growth, 3 to 4 billion to about $10 billion. But I think we can push up this 10 double if we can take, we should take the opportunity of global generics, which can add to $6-7 billion to the turnover, and research spend, we create a framework for research where multinational companies use Indian research capabilities of people as well as the outsourcing part of the research, and that will add to about 20-21 billion. And I think if we continue the same thing up to 2020, I believe we are looking at about $80 to $100 billion pharma industry. But this will not happen by its own. If you do nothing, we will end up at $20-25 billion industry. But I think if we consciously move both the industry and the government for this change, we can have an industry which is about $100 billion in 2020 from nearly 4 billion today. With this, let me just conclude by what Hemal and Prahlad, which is very well known in terms of strategic thinking, has said in one of their famous books, which is, I think, a kind of a reference. Companies and the nations, I would add, that have risen to global leadership over last 20 years invariably began with ambition that were out of all proportion to their resources and capabilities. But they created an obsession, the word obsession, with winning at all levels of the organization, and then sustained that obsession over that 10 or 20 years for global leadership. We call that strategic intent. I think with this thought, let me conclude by saying that I think if we determine to do certain things collectively and individually, I think there is much more we can achieve. We know the environment is quite hostile in terms of the opportunities we have as a nation, as an industry, in terms of the political environment, I would say. But I think we have to change that environment. And if we change that environment and look as an industry in this global context, there is much we can do. Thank you very much.
That will be coming in our way. And the type of prescription, I think, steps that what Mr. Korakiwala has suggested, I think all progressive companies should look to these steps much more seriously, say in terms of grabbing the type of enormous opportunities what we are going to get, say in the global market. I think with this, I would definitely thank Mr. Korakiwala for the type of, say, interesting talks that he had given. And now I request Mr. Ajit Singh to give him a flower of bouquet and a memento as a token of our appreciation. Now I'll take this opportunity of introducing some of the distinguished dignitaries on the dais. Mr. Samprada Singh, I think as we know, is the chairman of Alchem Group of Companies, a very renowned and a very successful entrepreneur in the Indian industry. Mr. Devendra Pal, again, I think a well-known figure in the Indian pharmaceutical industry. He is again basically a very senior consultant, and he is having his own consultancy firm for the pharma industry. I think he is also there on the dais. Mr. B.N. Singh, the director of Alchem Group of Companies. I think we welcome all of them and we wish them all the success in their own areas. And I request Mr. Brahma to offer a flower of bouquet to all these three persons. before we take a small break for tea, I personally feel that since we are running short of the time and we have, I think, somewhat delayed 1982, subsequently worked in JJ Hospital in the next 5 years in psychiatry department and diabetology department, and went to London in 1989 and worked as a trainee general practitioner for 2 years. He has come back to India in 1991 and worked in the field of HIV and AIDS for 2 years with National Addiction Research Center till 1993. He then moved to work in the field of occupational health for 6 years in 1999 and received a certificate in occupational health and industrial medicine from WHO and ILO after a brief training at the Central Level Institute, Mumbai. I invite Dr. Bharat to come forward and give his presentation talk on a very interesting topic, that is biomedical technology in 21st century.
Good afternoon to all the esteemed pharmaceutical pioneers of our country and the other colleagues. I won't be speaking so much on biomedical technology as much I will be speaking on gene therapy as such, because what we have already heard just now, that the book of life has been decoded, what is called the human genome. And on June 26th, Bill Clinton and Tony Blair addressed a transatlantic conference to announce that international government-funded project and Celera Genomics, a private US company, have both produced a working draft out of 3.1 billion chemical letters that contain the entire biological secrets of the human life. Humanity was stunned. The breakthrough promises startling new medicines and cures for currently fatal diseases. Clinton said that this genetic listing has at one stroke added 25 years to the life of Tony Blair's son, newborn Leo. But it also brings mankind face to face with a sort of future Aldous Huxley predicted in Brave New World, a world peopled with castes created through genetic manipulations. From the ruling alphas to the slaves of epsilons. A cure for cancer and Alzheimer's disease may be just now a matter of time. But ultimately this knowledge can also give power to some future Hitler to create a master race to his own specifications. What is certain that from 20 years from now, life and death will be profoundly different from what we experience. For the layperson, the year 2000, here is the new science of genomics. What is the human genome? If you thought information science deals only with computers, it is time to think again. Life is essentially about movement and propagation of information. We humans are nothing but packets of information. Like all living beings, humans are made up of cells. The nucleus of every cell, there is 46 chromosomes. Each chromosome is composed of deoxyribonucleic acid, or DNA as it's commonly known, and some proteins. Half the chromosomes are derived, obtained from the mother, the other half from the father. The book of life is written in the alphabet of DNA, comprising 4 letters, A, G, C, and T. The base chemical units, adenine, guanine, cytosine, and thymine, which constitute the DNA molecule. Genes are the words and sentences formed from these letters. The basic units of information that determine how a human being will be and how he will carry out essential functions like digestion, growth, fighting disease, etc. Genes are strings of triplet codes called codons, arrangements of 3 letters of AGCT. Genome is the complete information mass, of which 97% is junk in a human body. What is the Human Genome Project? What is this working draft about? It is about deciphering the book of life. The reading of this new scripture began in the 80s, and the project was completed in 16 laboratories in 6 countries. Aims to identify all the approximate 50,000 genes in humans and determine all the sequence of the 3.1 billion chemical bases. The working draft is the rough sequence of all the letters of the DNA alphabet as they are arranged on human chromosomes. The draft will now serve as the basis for obtaining high quality finished sequence and will also be a valuable tool for researchers hunting down the diseased genes. Why is this being called the biggest scientific achievement since nuclear power and antibiotics? This working draft is a small diffident step forward, but its implications are stunning. Carried to its logical conclusion, it will beget a whole new biological science called genomics. Till now, only a few human genes have been deciphered, and there too, not all the resulting functions are clear. Once the project cracks the whole final sequence, every physiological function, structural detail, and behavioral trait of man will be explained in terms of genetic makeup. This will give us dramatic insights into the causes of currently incurable diseases, like Alzheimer's, cancer, and lead to revolutionary new medicines we call it pharmagenomics on the internet. And of course, the far off controversial possibility of parents being able to choose the type of offspring they want. How do genes work? The various parts and structures of man are made up of proteins. Our skin is made up of keratin, our muscles and cartilages of collagen, and so on. Some proteins are also enzymes that enable essential functions like digestion. Proteins are also chains of amino acids. Now each gene is a sequence of triplet codes which stands for an amino acid. So each gene is the coded formula and instruction for the manufacture of a protein required for a purpose. Thus, genes are like clues in a cryptic crossword. The solved crossword will yield a jigsaw puzzle. Composed of proteins, fitting together these pieces will mean the full decoding of human life. Are genes the sole determinants of our traits? The unfolding of human genetics is like a philharmonic orchestra. Like in one magazine it was written, like the Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, various instruments either playing together or following and or chasing one another in a harmony. Simple physiological facts are for sure the result of particular genes, but most behavioral traits and certain special abilities, if at all, they can be determined genetically, can't be pinned down to any one gene. In most instances, complex human traits are the result of many genes working together in tandem, just like philharmonic musicians. This is called pleiotropy. Then, of course, there is the environment. Like in crocodiles, they say, genes that determine sex are temperature dependent. And a few degrees here and there can produce the difference between a male and a female. So who wins, the genes or the environment? There can be no winners in this, because this is hardly a race. The right term probably is interactionism. That is, neither genes nor the environment can by themselves account for what a human being is or can be. The American population geneticist Richard Lewontin, British neurochemist Stephen Rose, and Canadian psychologist Leon J. Kamin argue organisms, read them as humans. Humans are complex organisms. Do not inherit their traits but only their genes, the DNA molecules that are present in their fertilized egg. From the moment of fertilization until death, the organism goes through the historical process of development. What the organism becomes at each moment depends both on the genes it carries and on the sons with identical genetic makeups in different environments won't develop in an identical way. What can be the spin-off of the Human Genome Project? Medical geneticists believe all diseases have a genetic component, inherited or resulted from the body's response to pathogenic germs, bacteria, viruses, or toxins. One researcher pinpoints errors in genes that either directly cause or contribute to disease. It will be possible to develop revolutionary new ways to treat, cure, and even prevent thousands of diseases. I come to a very interesting point here. In science and technology, in the latter half of the 20th century, two fields have stood out for their speed of progress and their effect on society: biomedicine and computation. We are here to assess the challenges and the opportunities presented by the convergence of these two disciplines. The principal obstacle impeding the effective healthcare is lack of new knowledge, and the principal mission worldwide is to overcome that obstacle. At this point of impact of computer technology is so extensive, it is no longer possible to think about what that mission can be without computers. Increasingly, researchers are spending less time in their wet labs gathering data and more time on computation. As a consequence, more researchers find themselves working in teams to harness these new technologies. A broad segment of the biomedical research community perceives a shortfall of suitably educated people who are competent to support these teams. The problem is not a shortage of computationally sophisticated associates, however. What is needed is a higher level of competence in mathematics and computer science among biologists. While that trend will surely come on its own, it is in the interest, as they say in the National Institute of Health in USA, to accelerate the process. Digital methodologies, and not just digital technology, are the hallmark of tomorrow's biomedicine. The National Institute of Health will find out ways to discover, encourage, train, and support the new kinds of scientists needed for tomorrow's science. To make optimal use of information technology, biomedical researchers need, first of all, the expertise to marry information technology to biology in a productive way. New hardware and software will be needed, together with deepened support and a collaboration from experts in allied fields. Inevitably, those needs will grow as biology moves increasingly from a bench-based to a computer-based science. As models replace some environment experiments and complement others, as lone researchers are supplemented by interdisciplinary teams. The overarching need is for an intellectual fusion between biomedicine and information technology. Biology is becoming increasingly complex and computation is becoming increasingly sophisticated. Today's biomedical computing needs resources that go beyond desktop computers to local clusters of processors, to mid-level facilities, and to the most powerful computers at national centers. Many biomedical researchers cannot do their work from their desktop computers alone. They need varying amounts of computing power at different times, and all those resources should be made available. The infrastructure must be better balanced for a dynamic range of computational needs. Powerful computers are not alone enough. The entire support system must be in place. Even researchers who can do their work on small clusters need access to the expertise to set up and manage those clusters, and need support from programmers who can write and adopt the necessary software. As the computing power needs increase, so do the support needs increase. Pharmaceutical industry can make a powerful contribution to the development of tomorrow's biomedical research community by increasing efforts to promote and support computational biology today. The natural byproduct of their emphasis on biomedical research will be a new generation of researchers who are skillful with computing and who will have helped to create the computational tools they need to meet tomorrow's challenges. What is gene therapy and what are its objectives? Recent advances in understanding and manipulating genes, the biological units of heredity, have set the stage for scientists to alter patients' genetic materials to fight or prevent disease. One major goal of gene therapy is to supply cells with healthy copies of missing or flawed genes. This approach is revolutionary. Instead of giving a patient a drug to treat or control the symptoms of a genetic disorder, physicians attempt to correct the basic problem by altering the genetic makeup of some of the patient's cells. Hundreds of major health problems are influenced by genes functions. In future, gene therapy could be used to treat many of these conditions. Theoretically, it could be also used to alter germ cells, what is called the sperm or the egg cell. That is called germline therapy, where during genetic screening, flawed fertilized egg can be removed and a corrected fertilized egg will be reintroduced to the mother's womb. Theoretically, however, the possibility of germline therapy, gene therapy, is beset by difficult ethical and social questions, as well as technical obstacles. Gene therapy could also be used as a drug delivery system. To accomplish this, a gene that produces a useful product would be inserted into the DNA of the patient's cells. For example, during blood vessel surgery, a gene that makes an anti-clotting factor could be inserted into the DNA of cells lining the blood vessels to help prevent dangerous blood clots from forming. Many other conditions may also lend themselves to treatment using this general approach. As medicine operates increasingly on the molecular level, using gene therapy for drug delivery could save much of effort and expense. It could shortcut the lengthy and complicated process of collecting large amounts of genes protein product, purifying that product, formulating it as a drug, and administering it to the patient. However, gene therapy is still extremely new and highly experimental. The number of approved trials is extremely small, and relatively few patients have been treated to date. What are the basic steps involved in current gene therapy experiments? In some current experiments, cells from the blood or bone marrow are removed from the patient and grown in laboratory under conditions that encourage them to multiply. Then the desired gene is inserted into the cells with the help of a disabled virus. This is called recombinant technology. In other cases, liposomes or disabled viruses may be used to deliver the gene directly to cells within the patient's body. Much attention has been focused on the so-called genetic metabolic diseases in which a defective gene causes an enzyme to be either absent or ineffective in catalyzing or a particular metabolic reaction effectively. A potential approach to the treatment of genetic disorders is gene therapy. This is a technique whereby the absent or faulty gene is replaced by a working gene, so that the body can make the correct enzyme or protein and consequently eliminate the root cause of the disease. The most likely candidates for future gene therapy trials will be rare diseases like the Lesch-Nyhan syndrome, a distressing disease in which patients are unable to manufacture a particular enzyme. This leads to a bizarre impulse for self-destruction, self-mutilation, including very severe biting of lips and fingers. The normal version of the defective gene in this disease has now been cloned. If gene therapy does become practicable, the biggest impact would be on the treatment of disease where a normal gene needs to be introduced into only one organ. One such disease is phenylketonuria. PKU affects about 1 in 12,000 children in the European world, and if not treated effectively can result in severe mental retardation. The disease is caused by a defect in a gene producing a liver enzyme. If detected early, the child can be placed on a special diet for the first few years, but this is very unpleasant and can lead to many problems in the family. The types of gene therapy thus far have all one factor in common. That is, the tissues that are treated are somatic. Somatic cells include all the cells in the body, excluding sperm cells and egg cells. In contrast to this is the replacement of defective genes in germline cells. There's one, the first child who was detected to have, they were a Roman Catholic family. Her name was, was an article which I read on the internet, transforming diseased lives using new genes. Almost 9 months before she was born, Brittany Nicole Abshire passed the most important test she will ever take. Her parents, Rennie and David, were both healthy carriers of Tay-Sachs disease. After they lost one daughter to Tay-Sachs in 1989, they swore they would not have another child unless they could be sure it could be free of disease. Genetic tests could diagnose the condition before birth. But the Abshire's religious beliefs ruled out abortion as a way of screening for healthy fetus. There seemed to be hope until the Abshires learned about this new technology of genetic screening called pre-implantation genetic testing. The experimental procedure has already been used to screen more than a dozen children for cystic fibrosis. Ova and sperm were collected from the Abshires, and several ova were successfully fertilized in vitro. After 3 days, when the embryo was in just the 8-cell stage, one cell was removed and its DNA analyzed. For 4 of the embryos, the analysis worked. One of them showed a combination of disease responsible for Tay-Sachs disease, whereas the remaining 3 were not even carriers. These 3 embryos were then reimplanted into Rennie's, and one survived to become Brittany. Brittany was born in 1994, January, courtesy of genetic testing. The first child ever to be certified to be free of Tay-Sachs disease even before entering her mother's womb. How are specific genes delivered to particular cells? I know this is very technical, but I would like to make people aware of this. In a typical scenario, scientists select a retrovirus that normally infects cells of the desired type. The gene chosen for transfer is snipped out of a source cell's DNA using so-called restriction enzymes that cut the DNA at specific restricted locations. This gene and a marker or selector gene, that is a gene that confers resistance to the antibiotic, say example neomycin, are inserted together into the retrovirus vector with the help of other enzymes. The altered retrovirus is then permitted to infect the target cell, integrating the new genes with the cell's own genes. That is called transduction. By exploiting properties of the selector gene, exposing the target cells to neomycin, it is possible to select out those cells that have successfully integrated these new genes. These scientific developments which led to gene therapy was in the early 50s, when Francis Crick and James Watson cracked the structure of DNA. Other major steps included cracking of the genetic code in the 60s, the discovery in the 1970s of restriction enzymes, the manufacture of the first synthetic organism E. coli by Hargobind Khorana. During the 1980s, gene transfer systems using retroviruses and lymphocytes were first developed. Today, improved gene delivery systems are taking shape, a development expected to move the field far ahead. Each of us carries about half a dozen defective genes. We remain blissfully unaware of this fact unless we or one of our close relatives are among the many millions who suffer from a genetic disease. About 1 in 10 people has or will develop at some later stage an inherited genetic disorder. And approximately 2,800 specific conditions are known to be caused by defects called mutations in just one of the patient's genes. Some single gene disorders are quite common. Cystic fibrosis, a rare disease which is not common in India, it is found in 1 in every 2,500 babies born in the Western world. Now let us come to some ethical issues. This content of this document was unanimously agreed upon by the WHO. The contents of this document were unanimously agreed upon by the experts present at the meeting. The rapid developments in the area of genetics makes it necessary to continue discussions as new developments take place. For this reason, it is likely that the proposed guidelines will need modifications at certain intervals. The group felt that it is important for WHO to provide leadership and in the international debate on issues related to ethics and the provision of medical genetic services. The recommendations that follow are designed to assist decision makers at both national and international levels to protect people and families with genetic disabilities, to recognize the great potential of advances in human and medical genetics for public health, and to develop policies and practices that will ensure that these applications can become accessible to all and are provided with due regard to ethics and justice worldwide. Advances in human genetics that have occurred in the past 20 years have revolutionized knowledge of the role of inheritance in health and disease. We know that our DNA determines not only the cause of catastrophic single gene disorders which affect millions of persons worldwide, but also predisposition to cancer, heart disease, psychiatric disorders, and even some infectious diseases. When used properly, this knowledge will be extremely important in helping to achieve better health for people in all countries. However, these advances will be only acceptable if their application is carried out ethically, with regard to autonomy, justice, education, beliefs, and laws of each nation and community. Genetics teaches us that there is no such thing as a superior or an inferior gene. Humankind depends for its richness and its survival on the interaction of the complex genetic diversity with the environment. The general considerations are: the medical application of genetic knowledge must be carried out with due regard to the general principle of medical ethics. Doing good to individuals and families, not doing harm. Offering autonomy of choice after adequate information is given, and facilitating personal and social justice. These principles have often been outlined by the WHO and other groups are the same as in other medical fields. The proper use of genetic data. Since we inherit our genes from our parents, pass them on to our children, and share them with our close and distant relatives, every genetic diagnosis, test, and procedures involves many people. It is ethically imperative that genetic data should only be used to the advantages of members of a family or ethnic group, and never to stigmatize or discriminate against them. Voluntary use of genetic screening and testing. There is no compulsory genetic testing on adult individuals or populations. Every test shall be offered in such a way that individuals and families are free to refuse or accept according to their wishes and moral beliefs. All testing should be preceded by adequate information about the purpose and possible outcomes of the test and potential choices that may arise. Children shall only be tested when it is for the purpose of better medical care. As is the case of newborn screening, when early treatment will be of benefit to the child. Prenatal testing. Prenatal diagnosis should be offered to those who need it. There must be no pressure on couples to accept such testing, nor to use the results of the test to compel either continuing or terminating a pregnancy when the fetus is affected with a genetic disorder. Decisions in the context of reproduction should rest with those being tested, not with physicians or the government. The woman should be an important decision maker in all matters related to reproduction. Prenatal diagnosis should be only done to give parents and physicians information about the health of the fetus. It's used for paternity testing except in cases of rape or incest or for gender selection like we have in India. Like amniocentesis is very commonly used to discriminate from the girl child to the, though there is a bill against it, but it is still in many of the rural places in northern India, it is still being randomly used. Genetic data should be treated as confidential at all times. Genetic data should be only used to advantage and empower an individual or a family and for the better treatment or prevention of disease. Data relevant to healthcare should be collected and kept by medical geneticists in confidential files. Genetic data should not be given out to insurance companies, employers, schools or governments other than after the full informed consent of the person tested. In some countries it may be possible or necessary to protect both confidentiality and non-discrimination through legal means. Genetic counseling is the provision of accurate, full and unbiased information in a caring professional relationship that offers guidance but allows individuals and families to come to their own decisions. Counseling is essential before any genetic testing is carried out and should continue afterwards if the result entails choices for the person and the family tested. Education about genetics for the public and healthcare professionals is of paramount importance. Education is a two-way process and geneticists and other healthcare professionals have much to learn from support and advocacy groups representing those with genetic disorders. Such groups are an integral part of genetic services and should be guaranteed a voice in policy and education. In conclusion, the WHO and its constituents urge to consider these issues as a matter of priority to facilitate global consultation and consensus on them and to ensure that ethical codes are put in place nationally and internationally so as to guarantee that advances in genetics can benefit the community in an ethical way. It was agreed that WHO and many other international bodies are correct in rejecting any intentional step towards human cloning as unsafe, ethically unacceptable and a distraction from the more crucial issues dealt with in these guidelines. Thank you very much.
I think we'll thank Dr. Bharat for enlightening us on a very important field of biomedical research and the gene therapy. I'll request Mr. Samprada Singh, Dr. Bharat, to give him a flower of bouquet and a memento by way of token of our appreciation. Now we'll break for a tea.
Have the lights dimmed and we can go to the slide presentation. Well, this is a very peculiar audience here because normally I'm accustomed and attuned to address doctors, and for the first time actually nationally I'm addressing marketing professionals. What I thought that I would do is, from a clinician's perspectives and some audits which we did on prescription audits, tell you some modern influences on prescription trends. Can I have the next slide? Now when you look at a prescription audit, either you have some organizations doing it, you have some NGO groups doing it, some surveys or questionnaires. And fundamentally we really don't have core data to tell us what really determines the bottom line of the prescription generation. Next slide. So we decided to go ahead, because I had some funding. We have an NGO called Asian Healthcare, which has a tie-up with the government of Western Australia called Australian Clinic, which wanted to study the Indian prescription trends because they did not get valid data. Of course, this is not yet published, and we got some support from IGM group of publications where I'm associated with. And we decided to do this Indian Prescription Audit 2000. So some of the findings which I'm going to present, of course I can't give the official presentation because that is in Perth, somewhere slated in November end. So I'm going to give you some insights into that. We had hired a group of 26 professionals who helped us with this audit. And I was the director for the same. Next slide. Fundamentally, we picked up the 5 zones in India. We picked up 500 top category 1 doctors. They were urban, from towns and from rural areas. 50% were the consultant crowd and 50% were primary care doctors or general practitioners. And it was evenly distributed. Next slide. And there was a structured questionnaire. There were tele-interviews at places where we could not reach them. Also, some of the places where we could do, we did personal interviews. In fact, structured questionnaire, tele-interview and personal interviews are a must for all the 500. And some places, wherever it was feasible, we did an electronic follow-up. Next slide. Then we looked at various issues. And I'm not going to give the real audit here because we have to give it in November end. But we looked at various tools which a marketing manager or a product manager through his medical representative uses. And we looked at their influence on these various categories of doctors which I just told you. We looked at the visual aid. And we often found that the time spent on the visual aid was too much, and most doctors felt that often they are having a very poor attention span when the visual aid is detailed. The attention span only increased depending if it was a new drug or there was something novel talked about, but most often the complaint was that there were too many number of pages in that visual aid. And they were definitely impressed by newer versions, laptop versions or CD versions, but they were not greatly excited. They just felt it was too much of hype and there was very little substance in the same. So fundamentally the outcome was that the number of pages on visual aids, most people felt should not be more than 2. Next slide. Then coming to the bottom line, I mean the center of the marketing is the medical rep, and what is he reduced to? How does a doctor perceive him? Possibly as a visual aid man with a bag, a sampler, a gifter, but predominantly an assistant for various activities, and possibly relationships. In fact, the core finding of our study was that most often what really mattered was the relationship between the doctor and the pharmaceutical professional, may it be a rep or may it be a top manager. And ultimately that changed the equations. Next slide. And had an influence on the prescription trend. Let's look at samples. The most important finding in the study was that samples don't matter anymore. Except for the general practitioner crowd, most people, apart from new drugs, were not really interested in samples. 80% of people who were surveyed felt that their samples often expired in their clinics. So they felt that samples should be only on demand and its utility was declining, and I think it's a huge marketing expense head. Next slide. Coming to initiation and PMS trials, coming to utility of samples, possibly this is one place where people still felt that samples had some use, and these were tools to prime doctors, particularly newer drugs, where there is a growing reluctance to use them, because we are in an era of evidence-based medicine, and every day a new research article is given by the rep to the doctor. So doctors are reasonably reluctant to use some of the newer molecules, and there we felt that these are important tools, and PMS and initiation trials do make a difference to them. Definitely they have a brand recall and registration value. They definitely give you an incentive to the doctors, and most important finding which we found in our study is enhancing the ego. Actually, one of the principal factors which determines the prescription trend in the Indian doctor was possibly his ego. Next slide. Coming to database management. Now, doctors traditionally are anti-computer people. You know, they like to only write prescriptions in handwritings beyond comprehension, and often we have seen that they are not very, ready to use good databases. Of course, these things are going to change with time, and they lack good software. Most of the top consultants find that they are seeing too many patients and they don't have time to really maintain good databases. But things are changing. Next slide. So, but there is an emerging scenario now. There is computerization. There are better softwares now being developed which are given as freebies either by the pharma industry or by the .com companies. And there are a lot of electronic provider partner interfaces which are coming up. And they'll become more and more relevant in the insurance setups. But as of now, this is still an emerging scenario, and I think there is more hype and little substance in the same. Next slide. Coming to gifts. Now, gifts is a huge issue. We looked at, most doctors told us that it depends on the type of gifts. Most of the gifts are household utilities, often going to their wives without looking at them. There's a declining interest. Most doctors could not recall the brand for which the gift was given for. And there is a very small group of loyal category which still demands a pen or a gift. There is a small but sustained loyal category which we found in the gift area, which is around close to 18%. Next slide. Looking at books and publications. Often when you go to a doctor's place, you find that there are a lot of publications. So we asked them, why are you having so many books and publications? And they felt that it had a lot of desktop value. It was important for the doctor's integrity and image, so for the pharma image. It had a little better brand recall because they could remember that this particular book or this yearbook was given by a brand called Covan. So they had that little brand recall for that. And we found that it was particularly useful for newer drugs. Next slide. Coming to literature mailers and company literature. Well, they are useful for product monograms, but more than 92% of the 500 top doctors we surveyed had dustbin value for that. They felt that this was having a tremendous pharma bias. They felt that the same doctors are targeted by everybody. Most people felt that where these pharma mailers should go are not going. Maybe the rural places were the only places which appreciated pharma mailers. Otherwise, most often they really meet the dustbin. And I think this is another expense head which needs to be looked at by the marketeers. Next slide. Coming to web media and computers. Now it's a little premature to comment on that. Most of the doctors which was our bias category, was thinking that this is emerging and premature. They felt it was only a hype. They could not really give you a brand recall. They could only remember the company which gave them the free softwares. They could rarely recall the brand on it. But this is a small group which is growing. And this we've surprisingly found that not the urban areas, but the smaller areas where there is no access to information or libraries, that is the place where possibly this may have a role. Contrary to the popular image where people feel that web and the computers will make a presence in the urban metros, I think doctors are too busy making their money and they are not interested in all these complicated gadgets. Next slide. Coming to another issue which we looked in very critically was conference and travel. Okay, and there we found that conference fellowships definitely yield results, but often they need follow-up. Because if you don't have that, then they don't remember. They know XYZ company took them to a free conference here and free conference there, and now you know the foreign joints have increased even from Indian companies, but they often did not remember it. So if you don't have your detail man to remind a brand recall value after the conference, I think you have wasted your money. Next slide. Coming to research grants. Often we found that most of the doctors admitted that whenever they were very tough with a particular company, and whenever they came when the company came with their medical doctor to do some research trial, their egos got pepped up and they were predominantly the opinion leaders. This was restricted only to the opinion leaders, which was only 50 of them, and they felt that there was a change in their prescription behavior. Next slide. Coming to CMEs. Well, most of the opinion leaders we asked on CMEs, they felt that this was a good co-marketing tool. You see, many of the opinion leaders marketed themselves with the general practitioner crowd, and so did the general practitioners appreciate the CMEs. But predominantly it was consultant and academic. But we also got a category of almost 60% of doctors who came for CMEs for free food and beverages. And they felt that the only use of CMEs was networking, distributing their cards for consultants, and for free food and beverages. And not very little academics. Next slide. So what were really the factors which influenced the behavior for a prescription generation in India? I think most doctors remembered the first brand which was introduced. And even today, if you look at it very critically, if you do your ORG audits, etc., you will always see that the first brand which gets introduced always has that brand recall value with the doctor. At least with these top 500, we found that. There is a loyalty index of doctors. By and large, they are loyal to XYZ. They try to maintain that. But trends are often disturbed by pharmacists and hospitals. Of course, there are commissions and partner programs which are coming up in direct or indirect ways, which I don't want to elaborate here, but doctors gave us some really horrendous statistics on that, how companies really partner with them, and they are making them agents for their promotion. But that has been increasingly used in India, and it's been increasingly successful. But trends are changing now. Next slide.